Welcome. My name is Isabella Brusati, and this is the very first episode of the podcast Let's Talk About Change Management. The reason why I decided to start doing this podcast is because of high demand. In fact, it's not unusual when I talk to practitioners that work in this space for people to tell me, oh, but do you have a podcast? And I'm like, I used to, but not at the moment. So I decided basically to carry on and basically create a new podcast in order to start sharing best practices when it comes to change management in the change community. Specifically, this podcast is going to be about the people side of change. Therefore, we're going to talk about how we support people coming on board when it comes to a change initiative. In fact, it's not unusual for companies to focus on the technical side, so to focus on the shiny new ERP, shiny new process, and then to completely forget about basically the people that need basically to start adopting and using that new tool. So companies tend to finish up, with a tool, and they spend tons and tons of euros, pounds, US dollars, or other currencies with these licenses and go, oh gosh, this doesn't work. So what do? They actually do the rework, redesign, and all the rest of it. In some cases, it's actually true that the problem is the tool, but in most cases, actually, it's not, because it's not unusual in the market to have, I would say, not a clear understanding as to what change management actually is. Hence, the decision to start this podcast to shed a little bit of light and also to share what are best practices. This podcast is going to be weekly, so every Wednesday at 7 a.m. Central European Time, you will have a brand new episode. It's going to be something that can, take you through your commute to work if you actually are going back to the office, or it can be actually something that you can listen to whilst you are having breakfast. I've also decided to do a video version because there are people that really enjoy watching videos, so you will also find the video version on YouTube. The podcast is going to be divided in seasons, so this is a very own season 1. And in the beginning, I am going to run basically the podcast talking about my experience. But of course, I'm also willing to share best practices and experience of other change management practitioners. And for this reason, I am also asking you to put in the chat who are the change practitioners, but also, project managers or people that deal, with disciplines that rotate or integrate with change management, because I would really like for this podcast to become a hub where people can come to basically listen to what really matters when it comes to change management. You might be wondering, hang on, but who are you to talk about change management? I mean, what are your credentials? Well, I've actually started dealing with change management. To be honest, it was by chance. And it was back at the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000. Yes, I am that old. And basically my background is legal. And I used to deal with mergers and acquisition, restructuring. And from the legal point of view, everything was perfect. We're talking about financials. You get this company, the company, you put them together, or this company acquires the other company, and we should get the return of investment. That rarely happened. And I was like, gosh, after the first, the second, the third deal, I'm like, hang on, something is not working. And at the time, change management was fundamentally unknown, whilst now, it's becoming more mainstream. At the time, the people side of change was fundamentally something that people did not talk about. So if you're talking about, executives, senior managers, leaders, etc. So I started basically searching on the internet and I gathered information. And I actually learned that there was called change management. And I've been very, very passionate about this topic since. And I worked in several companies. I worked at the beginning of my career mainly in the UK. And I work in law firms, I work in the city, so I did mergers and acquisition, integration, restructuring for major banks. And at the moment, I am working as a consultant. For the avoidance of the doubt, this podcast is not a podcast that is done on behalf of my employer. It's actually a personal podcast, so I will not actually talk about, for example, what I do in my day-to-day life or actually sponsoring, any kind of methodology. This is going to be a totally agnostic podcast. Of course, it can be, in some cases, some methodologies will be mentioned, especially when, guests will be invited to take part. In the first few episodes of this podcast, my intention is mostly to talk about mostly my personal experience, but also theories and best practice when it comes to why people resist change. There is a lot of misunderstanding, people dragging their feet, they are not getting it. Well, actually, the trick, let's put it that way, is neuroscience. So I'm going to start with neuroscience because there are a lot of leaders that unfortunately are not aware of how our brain works and how it's triggered. Of course, it's going to be very layman terms, so I'm not going to go and talk about, strange waves and this kind of stuff. No. So it's going to be very straightforward. In the next few episodes, I would also like to talk about, for example, how to do change management when dealing with digital transformation. There are a lot of companies that think that they are doing digital transformation when in fact they are dealing with digitalization, which is different, and we will talk about that. I'm also going to talk about topics like sustainability, as there are some companies that are embarking in their journey on being more sustainable. And again, we will talk about how you can basically use change management, so the people side of change, to get people on board. And then, other topics like dealing with a resistant sponsor, dealing with governance, what is a readiness assessment. So, all these topics and elements that are typical of the day-to-day job of a change management practitioners. But if you are basically new to this discipline, we will be like, what are they talking about? I will also provide links to articles that are available for free on the internet. I'm a massive fan of books, so I'm also planning to do, the book of the month. And I hope that you will keep on following me, and, please also make people aware that this podcast does exist. Also put in the chat who would like for me to interview, because as I said, this is not a solo show. It's going to start like that because literally something that I've been thinking about for a while, and then, because of demand from friends and, clients and people in this space, I decided to go ahead. So we're going to shape this together, and please let me know what, kind of topics you would like me to cover. It's going to be, quite a quick podcast, so I'm not going to go on for something like an hour. It can be, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, depending basically on the topic and what we're going to cover. Of course, if there are interviews that will be slightly longer, because I want to give people the space to discuss their experience and therefore share the do's and don'ts of change management, or, disciplines that rotate around change management. So thank you so much for listening to me, and please leave the comments as to the topics that you would like me to cover and the people that you would like me to interview. The podcast is going to be in English. I am Italian, as you can hear from my accent, but I think that doing the podcast in English is going to give more people the opportunity to access the information. As in Italian, there are some people who speak Italian, but not as many as those who speak English. So I'm looking forward to talking to you in the next episode, and we're going to talk about change management, and then I'm going to go and talk about in the next episodes neuroscience and the reason why our brain basically is resisting change. Yes, it's all about science and not necessarily about people dragging their feet. So welcome to Let's Talk About Change Management, and talk to you soon.